Good. Please make sure to mute your microphones. That'd be much appreciated.
The sheriff substation where sheriff basically came upon him and took him
Just
to
a
the
sec.
factory for the Olympic March. Those are facts and ground. But the emotions here are just horror. And the horror sort of unfolds as you begin to create the details of this.
Okay. All right, let me get started. So I'm here to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sarah Reckhow. Dr. Sarah Reckhow's presentation she will be presenting on local public services and COVID-19. She's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at MSU. Her research and teaching interests include urban politics, education policy, nonprofits, and philanthropy in racial and ethnic politics. Dr. Reckhow's work on urban schools has focused on policy reforms in New York, Los Angeles, Oakland, and Detroit. Her award-winning book with Oxford University Press, Follow the Money, How Foundation Dollars Change Public School Politics, examines the role of major foundations such as the Gates Foundation in urban school reform. Dr. Reckhow was awarded a research grant from the W.T. Grant Foundation with Megan Tompkins-Stange to study the use of research evidence in the development of teacher quality policy debates. And another fun fact, Dr. Reckhow is co-owner of Lansing's book and coffee venue, Hooked. So off to you, Dr. Reckhow.
Thank you. Thank you. Wait for that. Thank you, Stella, very much for the introduction. So I'll try to kind of talk between the Zoom and the folks in the room. Thank you all for joining, for being here. I'm going to share my screen where I have a presentation and begin with kind of a little bit more of a personal introduction, and then I'll be sharing some research. First, something that's been published, and then second, something that's kind of new and still very much in development. So here we go. And here. All right, that seems to be working. Okay. So a little bit more of the personal introduction. Yes, I'm at MSU. I'm in the political science department. However, I was born in Durham, North Carolina. I'm not sure if any of you have been there or visited. That's where I grew up. Durham is also a college town in some respects, home of Duke University, and also home, at least when I was a young child in the 1980s, of a lot of cigarette manufacturing that was still going on at that time. So I remember the days when you would smell curing tobacco in the downtown area with Liggett Myers still producing cigarettes. So I feel like I had that perspective of a sort of old manufacturing in terms of coming to Michigan and then seeing it here with auto manufacturing. And, you know, in Durham, of course, those cigarette factories became completely emptied out, over the course of my childhood, and have since, it being North Carolina and part of the Sun Belt, have turned into tech companies and all sorts of things. And it's just interesting to draw some of the parallels of what I think a lot of folks are trying to see happen here in Michigan with our manufacturing situation. When I kind of grew up and moved on from college, my first job situation was I was a high school teacher. And this is a picture of the high school where I taught. It is Frederick Douglass High School in the city of Baltimore. Frederick Douglass is it's, as far as I know, was the oldest continuously operating historically Black high school in the country. So starting from the late 19th century, continuously through the point where it was actually Thurgood Marshall's alma mater. And there's a statue of him in the lobby of the school building. And yet, as the lawyer who argued in the Brown v. Board case and then went on to be on the Supreme Court, was like dealing with school segregation. It was incredibly segregated school. So when I taught there, The school was basically 99% African-American. And this was when I was a teacher in the early 2000s. It was also the early days of the implementation of No Child Left Behind policies. So seeing kind of firsthand accountability policies in that context was very striking. So at that point, I was transitioning and deciding that I wanted to go to grad school. And so I applied and went for my PhD in political science at UC Berkeley. Go Bears, and got to live in California. And then I arrived here and became a Spartan, and that's me and Sparty. So I have been at MSU since 2009. And one of the most exciting and rewarding teaching experiences I've had here at MSU, really kind of with the opportunity to draw together my interests, which you may have picked up on so far, involve a lot about cities and a lot about education and educational policy, was that I was the lead instructor for a program called InnovateGov, where through the political science department, we have operated this summer experiential learning and internship program in the city of Detroit. I was involved 2 consecutive years in 2018 and 2019, where we had 50 students spend 10 weeks in Detroit. They lived in the dorms in Wayne State University, and they had internships in city government, the school district, and nonprofit organizations all over the city. Incredibly rewarding and exciting teaching experience. Really remarkable to see what the students learned and experienced through that summer. Each of those summers, learning from each other, learning in the context of Detroit. While we had a pandemic interruption to the program, it's coming back this summer. And so those opportunities will be available to MSU undergraduates again. Other things I do here. Yes, as Stella mentioned, in the last year, I've now become a small business entrepreneur in my spare time. So this is with my husband, Matt Grossman, who is also an MSU faculty member. He is also the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research. You might see him on the news every now and then. He's like that guy that gets called when they need a quote about, the latest political happening, like Debbie Stabenow is not running for re-election. And who's the MSU political scientist, they often call Matt. But in any event, he and I are married, and we started Hooked, which is a bookstore, coffee shop, and wine bar in Lansing, just down Michigan Avenue, not too far of a walk from here. This was very much a passion project and a idea that generated over many years, and we kind of took the crazy leap and risk to start it. And it opened in April 2022. I'm happy to talk and answer questions about that alongside the research at the end. But for us, it's a lot about creating a community space and the kinds of, just opportunity for gathering and intellectual exploration and books and things right here in Lansing, having been here for many years and unfortunately seen things like the Barnes and Noble that used to be in downtown East Lansing close down, and the loss of the Schuler books that was at Eastwood. I'm also on the Parks and Rec board of the city of East Lansing. So shout out to the Parks and Rec show if you happen to be a fan or watch. That's kind of my civic volunteering. And I have 2 wonderful children, Nora and Ari. Nora is a 6th grader and Ari is a 3rd grader. So that's a little about me. In terms of my research, so Stella gave some of the introduction. I study cities, I study education, politics, and policy. I also study the role of money in politics, more so though at the state and local level, rather than we talk a lot about that at the national level, but I study it mainly in state and local politics. And I've also recently done some work on youth voting. So I did a project on ways to promote more college student voter turnout in elections, and kind of drawing on some of my education work, but applied to how do you train and civically engaged college students. So drawing together some of these interests, some of my most recent work and what I'm going to talk about today in particular is actually the first and the third questions in the list right here. What explains school district decisions on in-person instruction during COVID? And then the third question, how has COVID impacted city public services? So yes, I'm interested in cities. I'm interested in what we as local citizens experience with our local public services, how incredibly unequal these public services can be across boundaries, right? You can have side-by-side communities where one has a very deep and rich set of parks and recreational offerings and, nice library and also, well-appointed public schools. And then right next door, you can have a very different experience of public services. Clearly, there are long stories related to these things related to segregation and the history of how metropolitan areas in the US have developed. So while that's a long-running interest of mine, in the most recent era, I've gotten interested and concerned about how, we've just experienced, obviously, a global pandemic. And a lot of what occurred during that time impacted our public services and impacted a lot of decisions that people working at the local level had to make and figure out, how are we going to respond? What are we going to do? How are we going to deal with this crisis? How are we going to continue to offer these services, or can we continue to offer them in the same way while we're dealing with this crisis? So the first thing I'll present is on the school research. That is now a published paper. So that is much more kind of developed and focused much more on the initial early part of the pandemic, sort of 2020. Whereas the second thing I'll focus on is some work on public libraries. This is much more work that's new and in development and covers a much longer phase of public decision-making related to public services in the pandemic. So this is the school paper, and it's published in this journal, Educational Researcher. And I had a really great group of co-authors, happens to include, as I mentioned earlier, Matt, my spouse, but as well as a couple of others, Catherine Strunk and Meg Turner. And this is some work that we dove into right when COVID was right as things were happening. So in the summer of 2020, we could see that a lot of policy was happening right before our very eyes, in an environment of a ton of uncertainty and questions about how to go forward. State officials are making decisions, and then of course eventually local officials are having to make these hugely consequential decisions about schools. Were they going to be open, when, how, etc. And so we started to track that, right? So the first stage of this research was actually simply to track state decision making. What did states do? When? Who decided it? What did they recommend to districts? But then we entered a new phase of the work by the fall, where it was based on the local district decision making, and for that we focused solely on the state of Michigan right here. So I'll be talking about both. So taking us back to March 2020, not my favorite month to remember. Things happened very fast, if you recall. So these maps, and this is data borrowed from research that we cite. But in early March, right, everybody's still going to school, still going to concerts, sports, everything, right? And then you go a couple weeks in. By March 20th, right, a lot clearly has happened. And then that last map, March 27th, this is all the schools closed, right? So over the course of March, you had kind of the rapid rollout and the decisions largely happening at the state level, whether it's the governor issue an emergency declaration or some other state-led decision that said, nope, like stay home, whether, stay at home orders, school closing, et cetera. So it was an across the board, and it didn't roll out in a way where Republican and Democratic governors or state leaders were reacting differently. They all reacted the same way, right? It was rapid and nonpartisan. And this is a snapshot, which I'm sorry for the folks in the room, you won't be able to see this quite so well, but I'll talk through it. This is a snapshot of the data that we were collecting at the top, looking at what states recommended that school districts do during that initial spring when suddenly the kids aren't going to the school building anymore. What's going to happen? How are they going to get their instruction? And then going into September of 2020, what did they recommend in terms of reopening, if anything? So in the first period, that spring period when everyone's doing the distance or online learning, we tried to track bipartisanship, like did states require distance learning plans of school districts, et cetera. There just simply were not partisan differences. Some states required things, other states didn't. Having a Republican or Democratic governor didn't really tell you much about who did what. And then similarly, when we looked at the going into September 2020 of, okay, how are schools going to reopen? Some states provide sort of a phased reopening idea, like, okay, you reach this COVID level, you do this, you reach this COVID level, you do that. Other states didn't really say anything about that. But again, there wasn't a clear partisan divide about which states did which. So that was interesting, like given especially now, like looking back on all that happened with COVID, that this era and these decision makers were not, at least at that point, behaving in a way that distinguished clearly between what the Republicans and the Democrats were doing. However, as we know, I think quite well now, it became intensely political along partisan lines in terms of how political leaders and eventually the public as well responded to COVID. And a lot of that politics began to gel in the summer of 2020. So from that earlier point, okay, everybody's remote in the spring, heading into the summer. A lot of the, at least discussion of this points to Trump as a key polarizing force in what happened that summer. I've shared here the infamous tweet he included, that was July 6, 2020, of the schools must open in fall in all caps. But you saw other advocates and actors involved at this time starting to take more hard positions of either schools must reopen or it's too dangerous. And, again, the rhetoric kind of heightening as things go forward. So what happens then is that, well, someone has to figure out what's going to happen by August and September for school districts, of course. And what states did, including Michigan, is they didn't decide, right? The governors, who were very willing to say, this is what's happening, all the schools will close in the spring. When they came to the fall, they didn't say, this is what you will or won't do. They said, local districts, you will decide how to open schools. And this was everywhere, right? The states were saying, there were, again, a few exceptions as things developed, DeSantis in Florida being one particular case of a governor being very forcefully, all the schools eventually must open in person. But most states, Republican and Democratic led, left it up to the local districts. So then we're looking at a questions of, okay, so how did the local districts make their decision at this very early point in the pandemic? And the map I'm showing you comes from an organization called EPIC, which Catherine Strunk, one of the co-authors, is the head of at MSU. And this map shows how varied the decisions were in Michigan of local districts. The purple are districts that chose to be fully remote without any in-person school at the start of the school year in fall 2020. You have variations on the color blue that had some type of hybrid where they were either hybrid only or a hybrid option. That means the students are partly remote, partly in person, usually to reduce how many students were in the school at one time. You also have light green, which is fully in-person option. And then you have dark green where they are only offering in person and no remote option. So you had every single one of those menus of items happening in Michigan school districts at the start of the school year. And so we were interested in understanding what predicted why some school districts did some things and other school districts did something very different. And as you can see, in some places you have school districts right next to each other that are going to be offering their students really different modalities of education early on. So we looked at a few possible explanations, such as the severity of the level of COVID in the community, the political partisanship based off of the presidential vote at the county level, so how many people had voted for the Democratic candidate, the strength of teachers unions. There definitely was discussion and hypothesizing that teachers, especially if they had more active and had more power to sort of protect teacher interests, that they would prefer at least remote or remote options. And then the demographics of the students. And what's here, which is, maybe I can reduce this. Oh, but it doesn't reduce it there. Okay. There's a chart that's partly blocked that is showing the presidential vote and whether the district is offering only in person, whether they're offering some in person or whether they're offering only remote. Oh, there we go. And the quintiles at the bottom go from the lowest level of Democratic presidential vote in Q1 to the highest quintile of Democratic presidential vote at the county level. And so what you're seeing with that dash line at the bottom is the going from almost no districts offering remote school, only remote in the counties that basically were all Republican voting, to the fifth quintile where it grows and while the remote goes down, right? So the partisanship is one of the key factors related to school districts in more Democratic voting areas are more likely to choose the only remote than school districts in predominantly Republican voting counties. But the question, of course, then hinges somewhat on, well, okay, if you can model all of these factors together, what do you find? And what we found was that while, yes, there's some association with COVID severity, there's some association with teacher union strength, by far the largest predictive factor when we model all of these together was partisanship. And so this shows the predicted probabilities, where the predicted probability of remote gets closer to 30% only remote counties that are 60% or more Democratic presidential voting. So again, what we're seeing is that partisanship is one of the most important predictors we could see of how school districts decided to offer that. But what's important to note, and I'm sorry, this is very small, so I'll just explain, is that this is also reflected in public opinion. So it's not, just the case that, oh, okay, this district is in the, say, East Lansing and Lansing, they're in Ingham County. Ingham County is a very Democratic voting county. These districts started remote. They continued to be all remote for a lot of that school year. But it's also from what we see is related to the public opinion of the constituents. So this data is based off of something called the Michigan State of the State Survey. It is a public opinion survey of 1,000 respondents in Michigan. And this data was collected in fall of 2020. And so on that survey, we had a question about whether the respondents would support the schools offering an in-person option for their students. And the partisan divide was huge. Only 25% of the people identifying as Democrats in the fall of 2020 on this survey supported an in-person option for the schools. compared to it was over 70% for the Republicans. So we're looking at about a 50% gap. It's enormous, right? And this is already in the fall of 2020, that big of a gap. And so what you're seeing districts doing is very closely supported by where the public was. And so, you're looking at an issue that went from a uniform response, summer happens, and both public opinion and the decisions of these local districts very quickly reflected a very partisan set of views about how schools should be offered. Now, of course, then we can open it up to a much broader set of questions about, well, the students and the impacts and learning and things that we're now dealing with later on. But in terms of the initial decision making, this was hugely important. Now, I do want to extend this a little bit to what happened later on, because the story we tell and the analysis we do is mainly about those initial decisions in fall of 2020. If you closely follow what happened during the entire 2020 to 21 school year, districts changed. They didn't just stick with, okay, we're remote and we're going to stay that way, or we're in person and we're going to stay that way, because COVID, of course, was still changing and evolving, and a lot of things happened during that school year. So for example, these two maps kind of show you how much it changed, where in December of 2020, the state was experiencing a large COVID surge. If you recall, at that time, the governor issued a new set of emergency orders. There were various restrictions with restaurants, et cetera. And so you can see the purple has really grown in that map, right? A lot of districts that had started out with some type of in-person actually moved to all remote in December. Whereas by the other map, the one that's mostly green and blue, by May of 2021, most districts had moved to some in-person. There were just a few, including Lansing, that remained only remote for the entire school year of 2020 to 2021. So our story gives you a sense of where things went initially, but then it changed. And some of the subsequent research on this topic has shown that the COVID started to play a larger role in district decision making than they did in terms of that. Although the initial decision did sort of lay the groundwork for where things stood. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk about some newer research that is more in development for me. And it kind of does stem from this school research, because I found it very interesting to see how quickly things became so partisan, especially on a locally decided issue involving school boards that are, of course, officially nonpartisan elected bodies. And what I also realized is that we don't yet know that much about other local public services during COVID. A lot of people talked about schools. Schools became a really, really big issue, and frankly, still are in a lot of respects in terms of the story of COVID. But there are so many other public services that were impacted and altered during this time. And I wasn't finding much written or much data on these. And so the brainstorm was to look at libraries, which are also a really important locally delivered public amenity that's locally governed, but it involves something indoors, right? So it's impacted, as opposed to say parks, which were a different scenario. In some sense, many maybe got even more use during COVID. Libraries have these indoor facilities that still had the same kinds of issues with COVID precautions and COVID spread. So to give a little context about thinking about libraries, there is this book, by the way, Palaces for the People, which if you're interested in kind of libraries and public spaces is a really nice read. That's Eric Kleinenberg is a sociologist, and it's more of like a popular press book, really, really good book. And one thing, I've taken away from my little recent dive into libraries to learn more is just how extensive the services are that are offered by libraries, that they're so much more than a place to borrow books, that you see libraries that hire social workers. Libraries help people navigate access to a lot of other public services, especially because in many communities, they're a really important source of internet access that people might not otherwise have at home. They are regularly the location for after-school programs, which is the case, I know, right here in East Lansing. During COVID, they extended a lot of additional services, and there is safe and accessible public space for a whole, very wide array of age groups. And when you go into the library, chances are you're going to see very, very young children as well as older folks there at the same time. And so to kind of start big picture and with some descriptive things, I'm going to share some survey data. And this draws again from, I mentioned the Michigan State of the State survey, which we used for the schools paper. This is much more recent. So I got some questions on the wave of the survey that just went out in fall of 2022 to look at local public services and libraries. And so once again, this is based off of a representative sample of Michigan residents with 1,000 respondents. And this question is just, how often have you visited a local public library in your community in the last 6 months? And I didn't have really clear expectations going in about how many people would say they had. So it turns out that about half of respondents said they had never been in the last 6 months, but half have been to a library. And of the half that have been to a library in the last 6 months, it's pretty evenly divided as to whether they've just been once versus 2 to 5 times versus the 6 or more, which is the purple pie, which would be basically at least once a month or more. So, you could take this and say about half of the, if we're assuming we have a pretty good representative sample here, half of Michiganders are going to a library, which is, to me, seems like a lot of people. If you think about, large swaths of the population that just during periods of their life not have much inclination to go to libraries. This is an important public service in our state. So then I was also trying to get a read on the COVID public service question, like for how many people sort of felt or experienced that their public services had changed due to COVID. So this question I just asked, at the start of the pandemic in March 2020, would you say your community reduced, expanded, or mostly maintained local public services? And then gave some examples like libraries and senior centers and public transportation, et cetera. So on this question, the blue, the majority of respondents said that they had been reduced, a little over half. And then in red, they were the people who said mostly the same. The green said expanded. That's a smaller percent. So taking this away, there's a sizable proportion of people who experience some sort of reduction in local public services. Then out of that group, so only the people who said that their public services had been reduced, there was then a second question to ask, how have those services changed in the last 2 years? Have they returned to pre-pandemic levels? Are they still reduced, or are some still reduced, or are most still reduced? So about half said that things were back to what they had been before, but a sizable chunk, the red chunk, roughly a little over 40%, are saying there are still some services that are reduced. This would be as of fall 2022, since those initial COVID reductions. So this is part of what I'm interested in, is understanding this, what seems to be kind of a long tail of recovery of these services that were changed and adapted with COVID. And to give a more specific example, and something I started following along the way, you can look at the Detroit Public Library System, a really large library system. So prior to March 2020, the city of Detroit Public Library had 21 library locations operating. It's a lot of locations. And yet by May of 2021, so over a year after the start of COVID, only 6 out of those 21 library buildings had been reopened. Now, here where we are now, January 2023, 16 out of the 21 are reopened. So there are still 5 that haven't reopened, but they've, gotten closer. So that gives you kind of a more concrete example of what we're talking about here, that not every city has brought back everything that existed prior to March 2020. And again, to give you a little bit more of a sense of the motivation here, you can see this in other cities as well. So you had a San Francisco Chronicle headline in the summer of 2021, California is open. Why aren't San Francisco's libraries? And, we know again from the school story, as I shared, that there was a lot going on with political partisanship, at least with schools. Is that part of what's going on with other local public services as well? I don't know. Could it be other things? And we simply don't have as much data or understanding about what happened here with our other local public services. So I'll add that, in order to study this, it has involved learning a bit more about libraries and how they're governed. I have a lot of experience in researching school boards. Libraries have boards of trustees, and across the state of Michigan, some are elected and some are appointed. So there's variation on that. And there's also very complicated variation in the geography of library systems, which is making it a little harder to build the data set for this project. So if you're familiar with like our local region here, you have the city of East Lansing, which has its own library system, surrounded by the Capital Area District's library, which encompasses basically the rest of Ingham County. And so you have a lot of other unique boundaries with library systems. They're sometimes county level, sometimes city level, sometimes they combine townships. They're mostly funded with local property taxes, so that makes them very potentially vulnerable to the to local funding issues, where if there is issues with loss of tax revenue, but also inequality that's baked into property taxes, that you have some communities that are much richer in terms of their property tax base and some communities that are much poorer, and that can be very much then reflected in the what you have available to fund a library system. And then to give the specific example of Detroit, again, there's been this conflict, there's been the delay in reopening in Detroit, and the libraries are dealing with property tax revenue issues there. And so that maybe is also part of the story to understand that. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'll just say that in order to study library reopening, I am, by the way, working with a colleague, Josh Sapochny, on this research. And we came across a really interesting data set to figure out how we would know whether libraries were reopened and how much they had reopened. Because unlike schools where there was public information being collected, it's just a lot more complicated with libraries, and you have all these individual buildings to track. So there is a cell phone tracking data source known as SafeGraph. That we're walking around with cell phones in our pockets, and you can be this data is gathered and sold by companies. So SafeGraph has data on about 10% of cell phone users in the US and their location tracking, and you can download it as a researcher to see it. And so one of the locations they track is library buildings. And so it allowed us to gather from January 2018 all the way to April 2022, the visit rate data to library buildings across the entire state of Michigan. And based on a fair amount of data cleaning and a fair amount of double checking, And based on the fact that other researchers has used this data for similar purposes, it's actually quite reliable. And it's also just really remarkable to see the library usage data going month to month, and then March 2020 hits and, there it goes, right? It bottoms out. No one's going in these buildings, and then the change that happens after. But it tracks all the way to the building. Where we have a little trouble is rural areas. You don't have as many observations and cell phone coverage. And so we end up focusing on cities for this. Our data set is 115 cities. That includes the 100 largest cities in Michigan. And for now, we're mostly focusing on just a few variables as we build out the data set to try to see what predicts changes in library, what we think is library reopening or library usage rate over time, including the partisanship based on how the city voted in last presidential election, the share of Democratic vote. We also look at we're trying to track sort of the city's fiscal or human capacity, again, to get at this question of, well, maybe it's a resource constraint issue to reopen these buildings with COVID. And so that's another question. And then the county COVID community spread, similar to what I was looking at with the schools. So again, partisanship and capacity, sort of how much can you recover with a crisis are the two key variables right now that we think. And we think that the stronger Democratic voting areas will be slower to reopen and recover their in-person library visits, but also potentially that places that have more constraints on their local governing capacity might also have more trouble. And this is just a little bit of descriptive data to show you how dramatic the change was. And what I'll focus on here is the blue line is the Ypsilanti District Library, a very, very, very Democratic voting city. The orange line is the Lake Odessa Community Library, which is located in a very, very Republican voting area. And the gray is the Michigan average. And you can see how dramatic that change is in 2020 for Ypsilanti versus the orange Lake Odessa, which doesn't change that much at all. These are some regression tables, but I'm going to move actually to our figure, which I think helps to illustrate this the best. We do find a fairly strong relationship with the Democratic partisanship. So essentially a 1% point increase in a city's Democratic partisanship in terms of, again, based off of the presidential vote tallies, is a decline of 1 to 1.5 monthly per capita COVID public library visits. We don't find much for our human capital capacity, but we are working to improve that. But what we're working on more is this question that really what's going on here is a change over time. And what we're hopefully going to move towards is modeling this on a month-to-month basis. So what you're looking at here in the figure is breaks out the rate of public library visits per 10,000 residents, first in the period before COVID. So the data we have from 2018 all the way up to February of 2020. Then we have the period that's essentially a year of the COVID restrictions, emergency orders from the state, et cetera. And then what we're calling post-COVID, which is not really post-COVID, but like post, restrictive COVID with restrictive policies from the state. We track that as being basically summer 2021 onward. And the lines here that are, intentionally coded from blue to red are showing the darkest blue at the bottom. Those are cities where 90% or more of the vote tally is for the Democratic presidential candidate. And then it goes to 80% Democratic presidential vote, 70%, 60%. Purple is 50-50. Red, the first that up higher, red, 40%. And then the highest most is the only 30% Democratic voting cities. beyond that, we don't have enough city observations for even more Republican cities. And of course, many Republicans live in rural areas. What's interesting, and that we still haven't fully explained or understood, is that even in the pre-COVID period, there's more library visits per capita in the Republican voting cities. So there's something more to uncover about that that may be related to library services or demographics in these communities. I do not know. Clearly, everyone's library visits go down during the peak period of COVID. And then what you have is, in what we're very interested in, is that recovery section, the right-hand side of the chart, where you see, especially at the bottom, a really flat recovery situation for these most Democratic voting cities, where fewer than half of their library visits that they had prior are back at that period in time, compared to, again, not back to the same levels for the others, but much more of a V as opposed to an L for as you go up towards the purple and then the red. And again, we're still kind of trying to understand, is this buildings that aren't open? Is this the public not being comfortable? You know, as I showed, right, public opinion is also a big part of this. Maybe people don't want to be in the in-person libraries. Are these libraries offering more online services, right? I'm not really able to explain the whole story, but we are trying to begin to get a handle on the fact that public services did look really, really different in these communities and continue to look somewhat different even a couple of years after COVID started. So again, just putting some numbers to this. So the average so-called red city in Michigan, library visits climbed 63% over the sort of peak COVID averages. But in these cities that had a 90% Democratic vote share, they're up only 14% from where they had been during the sort of that initial year of COVID restrictions. So I'm going to wrap up here and so that we can have some Q&A and just sort of
really
add some
emphasize that
conclusions I have, but also a lot of
older people
questions going
and
forward.
persons of
Clearly,
color
our
were
COVID
being
response
killed at a higher rate
has been very polarizing.
than everybody else.
I think we've talked a lot about this, you know, in
Of
terms of
the
the national
Democratic.
dialogue in the media as a national level issue. But part of what my research is about is, you know, how this has permeated local politics as well. And I'm interested in trying to understand that better. Interested in the fact that local public services in Republican and Democratic leaning communities did look really different during the last couple of years. And I'm concerned and interested in the implications of that. Has it impacted public opinion? Has it impacted support for public services? Has it impacted how these communities are governing going forward? And I'm just also generally interested in, well, if we're seeing this kind of polarization around this in local politics on these things, does it suggest other types of partisan polarization impacting local politics in important ways? And what might we see going forward? So I'll stop here and look forward to the conversation. I should stop my share.
All right, the floor is open for questions now. Feel free to raise your hand or to put any of your questions in the chat below.
I'm trying to find how I.
Yeah, but there might be issue, right?
Should the if it-
volume on your laptop?
Stella, do you want to lead us into Q&A?
Yeah, Barbara, did you have a question? Sorry, I thought it looked like you were speaking. All right. So sorry, I was not prepared to be put on the spot, but Dr. Reckhow, what have been some of your favorite experiences during your time conducting research? Oop, I apologize. Did my question not go through? Oh, okay. Sorry, Dr. Reckhow, I asked about some of your favorite experiences from your time conducting research.
Wow. So one project I did, that kind of was I guess if I think about it, sort of a inspiration and precursor to some of the work on library. It was on Detroit and Flint, and how these two cities that experienced crises of different kinds, with Detroit and the municipal bankruptcy, and Flint and the water crisis. And in both cities, nonprofits wound up stepping in a pretty huge way in terms of that response. And one thing I was doing a lot of during that research was driving to Flint during the kind of year or so after the water crisis finally became acknowledged by the state of Michigan, and an emergency had been declared. And I was attending these meetings that a group of nonprofits had started during as the crisis was developing, to try to coordinate emergency response when an emergency declaration really hadn't even occurred yet, because it hadn't been acknowledged by the governor or anyone. But and it was remarkable to spend time with this group of people. They were meeting continuously through awful circumstances, through being told that they were wrong, that there wasn't a problem with the water first for months. They were on their own for a period of time in terms of coordinating bottled water, and then kept working. When the state started finally sending people in, then the federal government, and then everybody was paying attention to Flint. And it was just, while it was an awful situation, it was such a admirable and remarkable group of people to just know to see that happen. But I will say it was a lot of faith-based groups and nonprofits that were there throughout, with the actual capacity to do, and there was so much distrust in government, right? That in some respects these organizations had to be the front lines, because if you knocked on someone's door and Clinton said you were from the state, they never had anything to do with it.
Great, that's wonderful to hear. I've also spent some time working with communities in Flint and just learned how resilient and wonderful they all are there. And they're just wonderful people to be around. We have a question from Joel in the chat. He asks, have you looked at whether any nonprofits stepped in to supplement the closing of the schools and libraries? For example, Boys and Girls Club stepping in for members by offering in-person help with.
Yeah, that is a great question. So I do know, I haven't systematically looked at that, but definitely with schools, there was a huge amount of that type of activity going on, of organizations stepping in to be a place where kids could go when school buildings were not open or offering supplemental services. And sometimes it was public sector too, just not, so for example, in East Lansing, you actually had the city offering sort of through their Parks and Rec programming, they were the ones offering a sort of physical play at the Hannah Center for kids to go to while the school buildings were not actually physically open. And there were other examples of that as well, if you look around the country. Libraries, I don't know. So, but again, that work is a lot newer for me. So I don't know what I'd say you see on the adaptation of libraries, that again, we have actually some really nice state level data on the libraries, including on their online circulation, online material circulation. And so I'm looking forward to digging into that a lot more. I think a lot of library systems did a lot of that type of adaptation, building out their online access, or using things like lockers or other ways for people to check out materials without going into the building. So that's kind of what I've seen on the library side. So John, you have a question?
Yeah. I was wondering, you showed the evidence of the school closures and partisanship, and something very, very strong correlation.
Yeah.
Did you find any evidence that particularly severe local outbreaks moderated the effects of whether you were Republican or Democrat?
So not in the initial reopening plans, because in fact it was to the degree COVID was a predictor. Well, so I guess, so here's where it's tough, because there's multiple things. There's you only offer remote, you offer hybrid, you offer an in-person option, or you offer only in-person. Very few places offered only in-person schooling, right? So most, even at that outset, most places were offering something that involves some type of online, whether it was as an option or through hybrid or only remote. So we found a bit of a relationship between more severe COVID and you're slightly less likely to offer the in-person, but for the only places that were only remote, there was no relationship, at least that we found in that initial decision, with higher rates of COVID. So that would basically suggest the places that were the most Democrat voting were more likely to offer remote, whether they happened to be a place that had experienced a lot of COVID or only a little. But again, this is only as of August 2020, which, now with our long view, we know a lot of things happened with COVID after that point, right, in terms of ups and downs. But what I will say is that the research that has come after our work, like we were one of the earliest papers to come out on this topic. And so a lot of people who continued to study the question and look at the changes over time found that COVID rates did become a larger factor as you advance through that school year. So again, I think partisanship, when everyone was making their initial plans, it seemed like they went in predicted partisan ways, but as you advance maybe into winter and spring of 2021, yes, the response to COVID outbreaks seems to be a part of it. Yeah.
All right, Dave Olson asked in the chat, I think I heard that Ann Arbor schools may be going back to a mask mandate. Have you heard that?
So I did hear that coming back from the winter break this year, they required masks again. I don't know if that's currently in place, like as of right this moment, but yes, I did see that reported for Ann Arbor. I think just related, I don't know if it was even COVID alone or it was sort of presented as general response to sickness, maybe.
Yeah,
But
I'm
yes.
from Ann Arbor, and my sister attends Ann Arbor Public High School, and she hasn't told me of anything regarding that, but she usually likes to wear her mask all the time. So, but they're generally pretty careful about it over there. Dave also asked, do you think that colleges do do you think that as colleges do online programs, will that have an influence on K through 12 in the future?
Interesting. My sense, well, and I mean, John probably has some reflections on this with teaching at MSU as well. I mean, my sense has been that for a lot of people who are educators over the last almost 3 years now, the experience of online education has not necessarily sold us on it as a great educational experience. It is a fallback. It is a opportunity for flexibility when needed. You know, it's a way to deal with, you know, someone who, you know, a snowstorm or someone who has a particular illness and maybe they can Zoom in if it's a seminar, that sort of thing. But as the sort of, this is what we're all doing, it was not a very good way to deliver education for college students or K-12 students. And I mean, unfortunately, the academic outcomes that we've been seeing for K-12 so far are really concerning. You know, and there was a lot of kids didn't learn as much during the pandemic. Now, how much was that remote? How much was that disruption? How much was that the stress and there's obviously a lot of factors that you can't just isolate it to one thing. What we experienced during COVID was a lot of things. But that the negative academic impacts and the need for academic recovery are extremely real. And I would say it's also true for college students based on my personal experience with the higher ed teaching part.
All right, do we have any other questions? Or perhaps in the People's Church over there?
How did the availability of COVID-19 vaccines affect the decision-making of people?
That's a really interesting question, especially, of course, knowing vaccine uptake became very partisan. I have not looked at that systematically. Anecdotally, it was remarkable that it seemed to have an impact in East Lansing. I don't know how many folks here follow East Lansing as closely as I do, right? My kids go to school here. But the availability of vaccines for teachers in terms of definitely what I was seeing with our local board decision-making seemed to make a huge difference, where we went from being a district where it was, we were staying remote. January comes along, there's a little bit more of a discussion, and then the state, I think, was discussing the prioritization of vaccines. K-12 teachers were very highly prioritized, and very quickly, I remember this, the next board meeting, the next round of superintendent recommendations, suddenly there was we're talking about return to in-person. Even though there was a lot of COVID, and it wasn't as if, it was, I mean, if anything, right, it was worse than what it had been back in August when the district made the decisions. But the availability of vaccines for teachers is very, very important. I can totally understand that, right? That's incredibly, right? But there's a lot of this is teachers who are wanting to protect their families, teachers who might have pre-existing health conditions, right? And so their health risk is a big factor. And so I think it was a big factor here. This being a community where the uptake of vaccine, the sort of adoption of those aspects of the public health recommendations that yes, we should all get vaccinated was very strong in a community like East Lansing. Different in other contexts. I think as we saw later when now that unfortunately also become more partisan. Here's your question, but I didn't, I wasn't able to look at that in a system.
Slightly different subject. One of your interest areas that you were talking about was youth voting.
Yeah.
And were you encouraged, surprised, part of all those MSU and Ann Arbor students who were in line for 3 or 4 hours to get their vote in, probably primarily over the abortion issue, but just what's your take on that?
Oh yeah, that was wonderful. So I was actually at Brody Hall for a big chunk of election day this year. So I'm on the MSU Vote Committee, which is the group on campus that tries to promote and provide information to students about how to vote. And that actually tied into the research that I was able to do on this. So the research study is based off of the 2018 election. And for that, we did a randomized experiment essentially in the first year writing sections at MSU, and a randomized group of those first year writing sections got an in-class presentation about the logistics of casting your ballot in Michigan, just simply how to vote and kind of a very simple walkthrough. Within that, then a subgroup of those who got the presentation also received a magnet where they could pledge to vote, and they could provide an additional magnet for their roommate. In any event, we found that our experimental treatments increased the voter turnout based on matching the registrar data to the actual Michigan voter file where you can see the votes. It was actually a 7% increase with just about a 10-minute in-class presentation. It's like my mission to try to get MSU to do this in every first year writing section, which wish me luck with that. But anyway, the 2022 election was wonderful. It was so exciting. It was also, though, I think, on the one hand, it was like a great testament to how much we have, I think, adopted some really necessary and good reforms with voting in our state. Actually, in that 2018 election, no excuse absentee voting, for example, as well as same-day voter registration. What we saw in 2022 was our East Lansing city clerk and campus having to deal for the first time with how does same-day voter registration work when everyone's physically here? Because prior, there had only been the 2020 presidential election as a major election, and a lot of students weren't here. So it wasn't really the in-person voting. So we have 2022 comes along, students are fully in the dorms, off campus, they're all here, and we have an election with, as you said, a major issue, reproductive rights is on the ballot. And what happened, and I can say this from having talked to many of the students who were waiting in that endless line, is that the students, and this is so classic, right? They knew they wanted to vote. They knew this thing was on the ballot, and then didn't quite think about the fact that they were registered at their parents' address until the morning of the election. And upon realized that they probably weren't going to drive the 2 hours or so home, but they really wanted to vote. And yes, a lot of them because of abortion. And so but the word is out, right? You can do same-day registration. Well, if you can do same-day registration, that means you can change to your campus address and cast your ballot here. And that's what a lot of the students in that line were doing, right? They were in line to be able to put their address here so that their ballot could count because they're physically here and they weren't able to drive home and cast a ballot, which you have to physically do on the election day. So they hadn't voted absentee yet. They hadn't worked out a way to vote at home. They hadn't changed their registration yet. And so they were finally doing it now. But I'll add the other caveat that so again, students waiting till the last minute, no one's surprised. We would definitely need more capacity to address this, but it's also really confusing because a lot of students and just the way apartments are distributed around here, there are a lot of students who technically live in Meridian Township or even Bath Township, but think they live in East Lansing and would have good reason to think they live in East Lansing because they like almost live in East Lansing. They're right over the border. And that was a lot of the other confusion in the line in Brody, was helping these students figure out that actually they needed to get to the Bath Township clerk office, which there were literally volunteers from the League of Women Voters driving students to Bath Township throughout the day.
Following up on that,
Yeah,
because I worked the election and,
cool.
the former clerk got pulled from our voting place to go over to Brody. So
Yeah,
I'm hopeful that you will be giving recommendations so that you know, or you have some ideas of what can be done in future elections.
yeah.
You know, I mean, do we need more places where on campus where they can register? Because there was only Brody, right?
Yeah, so there are a lot of ideas, and I can say there are good people working on this. I think there's a few things. I mean, part of it is to somehow get more students to act earlier rather than waiting till election day. Yeah, whether it's to cast their absentee ballot. Because there was a satellite East Lansing City Clerk's office on campus for an entire month.
I know. They didn't use.
I know, but again, it doesn't entirely surprise me that somebody seems to wait till the last minute, but still, surely we can somehow be more, get that information out just in an even more obvious way. I think, besides that, yes, we probably need more locations and capacity on election day. But I think for that, my understanding is that both the East Lansing and the Ann Arbor City clerks are trying to get more state resources or something for just election day support, just so that they can be adequately staffed up for the election day. I think that some of the townships, like Bath Township, really should have a precinct where those apartments are, where so many students live, because they're supposed to vote at this Bath Township fire station. And a lot of them don't have cars and use the CADA to get to campus, and they can't drive to that fire station. So
You really think?
no, of course they don't. I know. I know. I'm assuming. Yeah.
I'm just stunned by the difference between the Republican communities and the Democratic communities and the return to use of libraries. And I'm still trying to figure out, is it because so many of them are rural? Is it because, so the use has always been like that? Or I'm just, as a former librarian, that's the one that just really curious how that, why that would be.
I know. I am too. I'm still surprised by this and still trying to. I think I mentioned that I'm working with a colleague, Josh, on this, and Josh and I are still trying, because I think another thing that we want to uncover a little more group of places that's sort of the high Democratic voting areas. We've got really different types of communities, like we're here in East Lansing, and I tend to think about places that might be more like this, and you have your East Lansing, your Ann Arbors, etc. But you also have some, you have like central cities like Detroit, but then you also have some very small, very Democratic leaning communities that are like inner ring suburbs in places like Metro Detroit that have really, from what I can gather from the data that so far, really under-resourced library systems. And I kind of wonder more about what's going on there and want to dig into it more about their capacity to recover and what is going on in these communities that I feel like I don't fully understand. Like the Detroit's challenges with reopening and recovering, I feel like I've been able to follow pretty well, but I think it may not be good long. But I don't know. I'd be curious if you have any hypotheses.
Yeah, we were also in this group here at People's Church. We were, before you came and spoke, we were talking about some of the issues going on in the high school, and I'm wondering to what extent that's another long COVID effect. You know, the discipline issues, whether that's just something we're beginning to maybe collect that on, having to do with these students and their years without having to be, social and university setting. We were talking about no conclusion. But just question.
Should I, there's someone on the Zoom saying they can't hear. Should I unmute mine and mute since?
Yeah, I think if you do those still can't speak, is that right? Is that
Yeah.
that need will be feedback?
Yeah, that would be, yeah. But they can't hear, so.
I think they can, yeah, they can hear you
Oh.
at least.
Oh, they can't hear
most
the
of
other,
time.
okay, got it. Yes, to your point, I mean, I've been thinking about that a lot, and I have today. I've been following a lot about what's going on in East Lansing. I do have kids in the school system. And there's, I think, some huge questions about, socialization in school, and kind of how students were impacted when they didn't have regular routines in school for a prolonged period of time, and then how well schools were prepared to adapt to resetting those expectations when the students returned, and maybe how much additional work would have to be done to bring that back, but also that, it was this very staggered kind of return. And so for a lot of students, the last 2 years, and speaking specifically, maybe more so to middle and high school levels, where you have larger schools, larger buildings, changing classes, more, kind of, not as quite contained and control in the way elementary classrooms are. Those students also didn't, for the last couple of years, they didn't have the kind of like building orientations and certain things that were a normal part of how did you adjust to middle school, how did you adjust to high school. Whereas for example, my daughter, who's a 6th grader now, with this being the first year, at least for East Lansing, that is coming back to being where everything's kind of happening again the way it used to. She had that. They had this special 6th grade orientation. The kids got to go in for a full week in the summertime for a couple, there were a lot of things they did. And a lot of the students, for the last couple of years, really, there were many things that, even if they were technically going to school in person for classes, there were other things that were not happening because everything back in, etc. And so I think about that a lot, that there's a sort of a cohort of kids that maybe, now are in their early years of high school or what have you, that missed a lot of socialization into how do you handle yourself in a large building with a lot of students and also a lot more temptation to, not go to class and not do what you're supposed to do. I really hope that the LPS can figure this out, and I think they're not alone. Though we seem to be experiencing that, of course.
Very good. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today, Dr. Reckhow, and sharing all of your experiences. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for coming and continuing to support Town and Gown. Thanks again, everyone.
Can I speak? Oh, great, thank you. So just a few of us left now. 2 weeks' time, Professor E.L. Aronoff from James Madison College will come in with another very topical topic, and that is the state of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. So please do join us for that. And also just, Sarah was rather modest in talking about Hooked. I don't know how many of you have been there, but I thought I would add a plug as well. It's a really wonderful institution. And I think it satisfies most human needs. And it's got coffee, wine, good cheese and books. What more do you realistically need in life? So yeah, I do recommend that people go there. And Sarah, thanks again for a great presentation.
Oh, thank
Okay.
you. Thanks for having
Yeah.
me.
Good night all, and see you all in a couple of weeks. Yeah, that was really fascinating. Yeah. Let me,
Dr. Waller, did you still want to speak briefly?
I think so. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, Stella.
Hello, Sandy. How are you?
Well, good, thank you. Looking to sort of get ready
Mhm.
for February 1 at the Scene Shop. A couple of things. Is there a wait list developing right now?
Let me check. When I checked yesterday, there was not one.
Okay.
Let me pull it up.
Cool.